In South Wales, United Kingdom, three 16-year-old girls were strangled. This incident launched the country's biggest manhunt and the groundbreaking way the police found the serial perpetrator known as the Saturday Night Strangler. In July 1973, 16-year-old Sandra Newton had been out with her boyfriend in nearby Briton Ferry when she disappeared on her 5-minute walk home at about 1 in the morning. Sandra's body was found 2 days later. She had been indecently assaulted, hit over the head, and strangled with her own skirt. She was dumped in a ditch near a coal mine in Tonmore. Little attempt had been made to hide the body, with it being left at the entrance of a culvert. The police suspected a local man was responsible due to the detailed knowledge of the area. The perpetrator would have needed to be aware of the remote dump site. The police believed that she had tried to hitchhike her way home. Then, 2 months later in September, 16-year-old best friends, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, were found deceased in woodland in nearby Landersea after hitchhiking their way home from a night out in Swansea. The girls had been indecently assaulted, beaten, and strangled before their bodies were dumped just 7 miles from where Sandra was found. It appeared that one girl had attempted to escape from her attacker and had made it yards from the road near to where her father worked, but had been caught by her attacker and was slain. Then, 2 months later in September, 16-year-old best friends, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, were found deceased in woodland in nearby Landersea after hitchhiking their way home from a night out in Swansea. The girls had been indecently assaulted, beaten, and strangled before their bodies were dumped just 7 miles from where Sandra was found. It appeared that one girl had attempted to escape from her attacker and had made it yards from the road near to where her father worked, but had been caught by her attacker and was slain. These brutal attacks on the teenage girls sparked Wales's biggest manhunt for the person responsible. A team of 150 police officers questioned 35,000 people who loosely fitted the description of the last person seen with Geraldine and Pauline. The suspect was described as having bushy hair, a mustache, and being a man between 30 and 35 years of age. Luckily, this was not the only lead for the investigators. The detectives also had a description of the car he had been driving. Their key witness had seen the girls leaving Swansea that night, getting into a light-colored Morris 1100, being driven by a man. These crimes stunned an area where brutal crimes like these rarely happened. The shock of young girls going out for fun and never returning home created a real sense of fear, and this man was still at large. There was a tremendous outpouring of grief. The communities were desperate for somebody to be caught, but no one was arrested, and there were no strong leads. Many feared that the detectives would never find the perpetrator known as the Saturday Night Strangler. There were so many areas where the perpetrator could have come from. Working without computers, the police faced an impossible task as they sifted through a huge pool of possible suspects from a mountain of paperwork. Officers at the time considered that the same person was responsible for all three crimes, but someone was already in the frame for Sandra's. The prime suspect for Sandra's demise was the last person who saw her, and that was her boyfriend. But he maintained his innocence and was never charged. Despite the brutal similarities between the two cases, the detectives continued to run separate inquiries into Sandra's demise and the case of Geraldine and Pauline until almost 30 years later. Both investigations were linked in the early 2000s by an emerging crime-solving tool when South Wales police started reopening cold cases, hoping DNA could finally bring the people responsible to justice. Firstly, male DNA stains on Geraldine and Pauline's clothing were isolated to show they matched that of the same man, but the person was not on the recently opened DNA database. But a year into the new Operation Magnum inquiry, tests on Sandra's underwear gave the detectives their first major breakthrough. There was DNA present from an unknown male. Forensic scientist Dr. Colin Dark said, "I recognized straight away from a particular feature of the DNA. This was the land perpetrator. This was an absolute bombshell because this meant there was a serial offender operating in South Wales in 1973, ending the lives of young girls." The breakthrough also categorically proved Sandra's boyfriend was completely innocent. The detective that led the investigation, Detective Inspector Paul Bethel, said, "This was the first time in almost 30 years we knew that the same man had took the lives of all three girls. Because there was no matching sample on the national database, the perpetrator's identity still remained a mystery, and the detectives asked BBC Crime Watch for help. But scientists had come up with another trailblazing way of using DNA to catch the offender. Dr. Doc, whose team was continually checking the sample with new profiles on the ever-growing DNA database, said, "We started to think, was it possible that we could use the idea that crime can run in families? You inherit your DNA from your parents and you pass your DNA on to a child, so could we look on the DNA database for a child of the offender?" This was a definite possibility. Dr. Doc said that meant getting a spreadsheet printout of several thousand DNA profiles from men in the South Wales area, sitting down with a pencil and a ruler, and crossing out everyone that does not match. He said, "After several hours of going through the process, we were left with about 100 names. They were all exact half matches to the offender's profile, so they were potentially children of the offender." This was a groundbreaking technique, the first time it had ever been done in the UK, and possibly the world. And from there, the new investigative tool, now known as familial DNA, was developed. Meanwhile, the detectives had painstakingly whittled down the list of 35,000 possible offenders to just 500 prime suspects. Detective Inspector Bethel said that their short list was based on the description of the individual, whether the person owned an 1100 car, and whether they had previous convictions of violence or offenses. After cross-referencing both lists, one surname stood out: Kappen. Local car thief Paul Kappen's DNA was on the database after committing offenses in and around the Port Talbot area, but he was only 7 at the time of the crimes. His dad, however, had been questioned back in 1973 because he fitted the description of the wanted man and drove a light-colored Morris 100 that same year. The police visited a nightclub bouncer and part-time bus driver, Joseph Joe Kappen's house on Port Talbot's Sandfields Council estate. But he had an alibi from his wife, and he claimed that his car was broken down on the night of the attacks. According to Detective Inspector Bethel, Joe was known in the community as a bit of a thug, and he had a history of domestic violence and had been to prison on several occasions. With his son's DNA proving he was a 50% match of the offender's DNA, Joseph William Kappen became the prime suspect decades after the crimes happened. But there was a problem getting a DNA swab from him. When they knocked on his door, Kappen had passed away of lung cancer 11 years earlier in 1990 at the age of 48. To confirm the police suspicions, scientists requested DNA swabs from Kappen's ex-wife and daughter to compare them to the perpetrator's sample. That gave them 2/3 of a full profile for Joe Kappen. When that DNA was compared to the crime stain profile, they could see that it matched, but needed the full profile to make absolutely sure that they had identified the perpetrator. The detectives were determined to be absolutely certain that Kappen was the perpetrator, so that the families of the three girls could have some sort of closure. That meant exhuming Kappen's body, which would be the first time that a suspect would be exhumed in the UK to prove guilt. The detectives needed to go to the top for permission and seek the Home Secretary's approval. The then Home Secretary, Lord Blunkett, said he gave approval for Kappen's body to be exhumed to find the truth. He said, "My main concern was whether there was sufficient evidence because it is a big step, and if you get it wrong, the families involved would rightly be aggrieved. My decision was very clear that Joseph Kappen's body should be exhumed to test once and for all that this was the man who committed the crimes and bring whatever comfort we could to the families. For the sake of everyone, finding the truth was really important." History was made in May 2002 when exhumation of the three-person grave began on the stroke of midnight. Dr. Doc recalled, "It was a horrible night, and just as we got to Kappen's coffin, there was a clap of thunder. It was the feeling that evil had been identified. It sent shivers down my spine." In 2003, forensic DNA examination at nearby Morriston Hospital in Swansea proved that Kappen was the perpetrator of all three girls. After almost 3 decades, Kappen was born in 1941 and had 6 siblings. His parents' marriage broke up when he was young, and he was raised by his stepfather in Port Talbot, a heavily industrial town in Wales dominated by its large steel works. Kappen began attracting the police's attention for petty offences since the age of 12. He went on to accumulate over 30 convictions for car theft, petrol theft, burglary, and assault, and spent years in and out of prison. He never stayed in employment for long, and he was described as a loner. In 1962, Kappen met his first wife, 17-year-old Christine Powell, and they married in February 1964. 10 days after they got married, he was sent to prison for burglary. Christine then gave birth to a daughter and then to a son, Paul, after she was indecently assaulted by Kappen after his release from prison. Christine later testified that Kappen was physically abusive towards her and would assault her every 2 weeks. At one point, he fatally strangled the family dog in front of his son while walking it on a nearby beach because it was too old. Kappen was known to regularly pursue local teenage girls during the marriage, with his job as a bouncer giving him an opportunity to interact with them. When working as a bus driver, he was known to use his rest breaks to approach teenage girls on the village green at Landasi. In 1964, Kappen attempted to force himself on a 15-year-old schoolgirl in his Sandfields housing estate, but she managed to escape. In February 1973, a man resembling Kappen picked up 2 female hitchhikers and drove them to a nearby isolated road before attempting to indecently assault both of them, but they also managed to escape. The victims did not report the incident, as one thought she would get into trouble with her father. Joseph William Kappen is notable for being the first person to be posthumously identified as a serial perpetrator via familial DNA profiling. He was also the first documented serial perpetrator in Welsh history. Kappen will always be known as the Saturday Night Strangler. He's also suspected of committing a fourth crime in February 1976. Julie Begley, Geraldine's cousin, said, "No words can describe the way we all felt. It was a huge relief. None of us ever stopped hoping that one day we would find out who he was. Although you get on with your life, it never goes away." Geraldine was a fantastic girl. She was always full of fun. It was not just closure for Geraldine and Pauline's loved ones, but for Sandra's family and close friends too. Sandra Newton's friend, Theresa May, said, "I believe I will see her again, and we have got a lot of catching up to do. I have been going down to her grave for 49 years, and it is hard to believe she is there. My beautiful friend, she had her life taken away from her, her future taken away from her. I still think about her now, all these things that we could have and should have done together. But after all of those years, she can finally rest in peace